Anna, so do you want to start?
Sure, and I'll be brief. I just wanted to first welcome everyone to the 26th Annual N.Y.U Journal of International Law and Politics, Herbert and Rose Rubin International Law Symposium. We're thrilled to have you all here, especially given the unusual circumstances. We're sorry we can't be with you all in person down on N.Y.U's campus in the Greenwich Village, but there's always a silver lining, and we're really privileged to have panelists from all over the world today. So, yeah, good morning to everyone, or good afternoon as your time zone may have it. Thank you, of course, to the Rubins for their very generous support. This symposium wouldn't happen every year without them. And the biggest thank you of all to our senior symposium editor, Helen Haft. She's the mastermind behind this event, and really everything you see here is a product of her wonderful efforts. So thank you on behalf of the entire journal. And I think I speak for the entire audience when I say how excited I am to learn from you all on these increasingly timely topics. So Helen, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Anna. Before I make some opening remarks, we have a video to show from Herbert Rubin, who has hosted this symposium for the past 26 years. So let me share my screen. Hold on. Oh, wait, sorry, 1 second.
Welcome to the 26th Annual N.Y.U Law School, Herbert Rubin and Justice Rose Lieutenant Rubin International Law Symposium. Today's program is entitled Russia Beyond Russia Gates. Why International Law? My wife and I were students at N.Y.U Law School from 1938 to 1942 and lived through the Holocaust years, possibly the most inhuman violations of the rule of law in human history. After graduation, we were fully occupied in the practice of international law and had a variety of European corporate and individual clients. In 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall presented to us and the entire legal community the opportunity to examine and strengthen the rule of law in international matters. The vast increase in commerce, investment, tourism, and other international relationships, as well as the increased political involvements of the various nations, caused us to propose to the N.Y.U faculty a number of academic projects. That resulted in the Rubin International Law Library, the designation of a Rubin Professor of Law, and this series of annual symposia, all at N.Y.U. Our objective was to focus a searchlight on the concept and importance of the rule of law in creating a culture of mutual respect and observance of basic rights, which were essential in the expanding array of political, economic, and social relationships throughout the globe. The range of subjects of the symposia over these 26 years has been very wide. Previous topics have included the Iran hostage crisis, control of nuclear weapons, Chinese aggression in foreign trade, women's access to legal redress, art in international law, financing startups in Africa, corruption in foreign litigation, and others. I had personal interest in the Symposium on global warming and the challenge of the Arctic areas because my granddaughter-in-law is the U.S. representative to the Arctic Council. Although disrupted and delayed by the pandemic, this seminar attempts to proceed in almost the same form as the previous 25. The present two-part program, conceived and structured by the very talented Hanna and Helen Haft, will feature panels of truly expert authorities for this discussion. Hanna and Helen's perception and foresight is amazing in their selection of Russia a year ago as the topic for today's symposium. They apparently foresaw the newspaper headlines blazing with the Navalny-Putin crisis. The presentation will conclude with remarks by our esteemed Professor Jose Alvarez, the N.Y.U Law School Rubin Professor of International Law. It has been a privilege to have sponsored these academic programs. At age 102, I continue to give thanks for the training and inspiration which I gained from N.Y.U Law School as a student, a teacher, and an alumnus. I'm confident that all of us will benefit from this symposium. Now relax and enjoy. Thank you for joining us.
So let me just begin once again. Welcome to the 26th Annual Herbert Rubin and Justice Rose Luton Rubin International Law Symposium. My name is Helen Haft, and I am the Senior Symposium Editor of the Journal of International Law and Politics. I would like to begin by thanking Herbert Rubin and his family for their generous support of the symposium, which truly advances our understanding of international law and gives us the opportunity to bring together experts in law, political science, and international relations. I would also like to thank Anna D'Agostino, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Law and Politics, for all of her help and support throughout this process. I would like to thank Seema Vitlani and N.Y.U for their tireless work in the lead up to this event. A special thanks to Professor Stephen Holmes, who as the faculty advisor for the symposium was always there to talk through ideas and help in formulating the topic for today and tomorrow's events. Finally, I would like to thank Jenny Rosario, Sue Anderson, Israel Rodriguez, Julian DeWalt, Joe Rivera, and Anthony Tiberio for their help in making today's events possible. Before introducing our first panel, I would like to say a few words about the origins of this year's topic, Russia Beyond Russiagate. Prior to law school, I spent several years studying and living in Russia. When I returned to the US to begin law school, I was struck by the superficiality of the discourse surrounding Russia and the lack of substantive discussion both in the media as well as academia. When I began planning this conference approximately 1 year ago, U.S. Russia relations were at an all-time low. While Trump's rhetoric may have suggested a coziness with Russia and Putin, the reality of relations could not have been worse. Russia and the US had decided to withdraw from the INF Treaty, raising the risk of nuclear confrontation, and Trump's constant invocation of Putin and affinity for him poisoned the topic of Russia, rendering any sort of real discussion off limits. The narrative of Russiagate turned Russia into a caricature, oversimplifying it and hindering analysis both of the potential for a working relationship between the US and Russia, as well as of the faults and problems within Russia itself. This has had the effect of both overstating certain threats related to Russia, while ignoring many other dangers, such as the nuclear threat. While With regard to internal Russian politics, the oversimplified notion that Putin is the sole decision maker and czar, or that there is absolutely no dissent in Russia, strips discussions of any analytical force. That is not to minimize the significant power that Putin wields or suggest that Russia is not extremely dangerous for journalists and dissenters, but rather to highlight the need for a more nuanced understanding of and increased literacy on Russia. There are contradictions in Russia, as in the US's relationship to Russia. We can both condemn the gross violations of civil liberties and rights, particularly those that have occurred in the past few weeks in relation to Alexei Navalny and protests that have broken out, while also understanding the importance of maintaining a dialogue with Russia as the country with the largest nuclear arsenal. Over the next 2 days, you will hear from some of the foremost experts on Russia on everything from arms control, internal Russian politics, Russia's recent constitutional reforms, perception of post-Soviet space, as well as the state of free speech, dissent, and independent media in Russia, from people who are themselves immersed in these issues. We will also be looking beyond Russia itself to what has occurred in its neighborhood, from the ongoing protests and brutal repression of dissent in Belarus to the territorial dispute in Nagorno-Karabakh. We will examine the relationship between these seemingly disparate issues. I hope that these discussions will broaden your understanding of Russia, challenge stereotypes for better or worse, and allow the space for a true analysis that goes beyond Russiagate. And with that, I would like to introduce Professor David Golove, who will be moderating our first panel on U.S. Russia relations. And just one quick note, for those of you who are here that are receiving CLE credit, I will be reading a code out at some point during the discussion that you can write down and send back to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Helen. I want to also welcome everyone to our first session of the symposium on U.S. Russia relations, manifestly an incredibly important and timely subject for us all to be thinking about. Let me also extend thanks to the Journal of International Law and Politics here at N.Y.U, and of course, particularly to Helen for all the work that she's done in conceiving and making this, organizing and making this symposium possible. Of course, also to the Rubins for their generous support of this symposium, the 26th annual Rubin Symposium on International Law. Finally, I want to extend special thanks to our distinguished panelists for this panel discussion. It's my honor and my job to introduce the panel and moderate the session. I'm going to introduce our panelists individually before each one speaks. I'm going to strive to keep my introductory remarks about them as brief as possible. They all are, of course, incredibly distinguished individuals and experts in the area of Russia in general and U.S. Russia relations in various aspects. I'm sure you would rather, however, hear from them than hear about them. So for that reason, as I said, I'll keep my remarks very brief. So let me introduce our first panelist at this point. Ambassador Jack Matlock. Ambassador Matlock served for 35 years in the American Foreign Service, retired in 1991. During his distinguished career, he held many important diplomatic positions, including as ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1987 to 1991, special assistant to the president for national security affairs and senior director for European and Soviet affairs on the National Security Council staff from 1983 until 1986, and ambassador to Czechoslovakia from 1981 to 1983. Since his retirement from the Foreign Service, he's held academic posts at a variety of universities, including Columbia University, Princeton, Hamilton College, Mount Holyoke College, and the Institute for Advanced Studies, where he was the George Keenan Professor from 1996 to 2001. He's currently teaching at Duke University. He's the author of a number of important books, not to mention many other works on U.S. Soviet and U.S. Russian relations, including most recently in 2010, superpower illusions, how myths and false ideologies led America astray, and how to return to reality. In 2004, Reagan and Gorbachev, how the Cold War ended. 1995, autopsy on an empire, the American ambassador's account of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So let me bring him on at this point, and after his remarks, I'll introduce our next speaker, Ambassador Matlock.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be part of the panel. Shall I continue, or are you going to introduce the other speakers?
Yes, I'll introduce them before they speak, rather than all at once.
All right. I will be speaking to you very much as an outsider, outside the current policymaking community in either the United States or Russia, but as an observer who in many ways was an insider at the time that we brought the Cold War to an end. And I must say that when I retired from the Foreign Service in 1991, Europe was whole and free. The Soviet Empire had imploded, or rather perhaps exploded. And yet we did not adjust the world order to this new reality. Where do we stand today? Well, there seems to be another Cold War, as almost as emotionally intense as the one we faced with the Soviet Union, with Russia considered at best an adversary, at worst an enemy. I believe that this is a very dangerous situation for both our countries, because the fact is, looking at the dangers we face today, the threats we face today, these really do not stem from the sort of the politics of the past, the sort of politics of competing for influence, the sort of politics of jockeying for advantage, either military or economic, between countries, the sort of politics that brought us to ruinous world wars in the 20th century. What we face today are truly existential threats, and we face them jointly, not only America and Russia, but with all other countries of the world. One of them, as should be obvious today, is pandemics, whether accidentally or, heaven forbid, artificially produced. Quite frankly, we are not coping with that very well. And yet, this is one area where it should be obvious that we're all in it together. We can't solve this individually. And then nuclear weapons. We still have enough nuclear weapons, if they are used, will destroy humanity. I mean, not just civilization, but humanity, and maybe higher forms of life on this planet. And then we're facing the tremendous transformative pressures of environmental degradation, global warming, and all of the consequences of that, because it is going to cause great dislocations of population and other things. These life-threatening challenges face us both, and they cannot be solved by us individually or even by us cooperating unless we cooperate with others. So I do see that the various arguments that have developed, the attitudes that have developed, are not in the interest of either of our countries. And I think, if I think back, how is it that we ended within a period of 3 or 4 years, a confrontation previously, where both sides were locked in what seemed to be an unending arms race, particularly a nuclear arms race. We turned it around. We turned it around from what looked like one of the low points of the Cold War, or high points, if you want to consider tension. Because in 1983, I was brought on to the National Security Council staff in Washington with the instructions to try to develop, obviously with the cooperation of others, a strategy for ending the arms race. How did we do that? Obviously, it could be done only with the cooperation of the Soviet leaders. I've detailed elsewhere exactly how we developed it, but what are the things that we were doing then that we are not doing now? Well, first of all, we stopped trying to upstage the other publicly by making proposals that the other either had to accept or looked as if they were mad. We started discussing privately, all right, where are our common interests? How can we cooperate there? And what is the holdup on this other thing? What sort of proposals can we do before we announce them publicly? Let us cooperate where we can. That was one thing. The second thing is, although President Reagan was very critical of the Soviet system, calling it an evil empire, he never insulted or personalized any Soviet leader. He dealt with them with respect. And therefore, when finally Mikhail Gorbachev was the Soviet leader, these efforts to find common interests, to define our ends, not as something they had to do, but as something we could do cooperatively. When we talked about human rights, we said we must cooperate to improve human rights. We didn't say, you got to do this, you got to do that. And when they came back and said, okay, can we talk about the racial situation or the status of women in the United States? Our answer was yes, of course. We think we're making progress, but we're not there yet, and we can use all the help we want. Now, that didn't mean we were equating necessarily the human rights situation in both countries. That wasn't the point. The point was that you were not going to help these things to be improved unless you dealt with them quietly and without making it look as if you were forcing one side simply to do your bidding. There are many other elements here, but I would say that since the end of the Cold War, we have followed both in our media, our principal media, and in our official, sort of the opposite in most of those things, by going public even with the most sensitive things, and by, in many cases, very deeply involving ourselves in the internal politics. Now, this came about because I think very mistakenly, there was the attitude in the West that we won the Cold War, the Soviet Union was defeated. Look, they even broke up totally. No, we negotiated an end to the Cold War in the interest of both countries. And when the Soviet Union broke up, it broke up because of internal pressures that could not have been brought successfully to bear if the Cold War had continued. And the breakup of the Soviet Union, aside from the freedom of the three Baltic states, which we always supported, it was not an object of American policy. In many ways, when we saw that Gorbachev was democratizing the Soviet Union, we would have preferred a voluntary federation or confederation of 12 republics. But Obviously, this was not something for us to decide, and it happened. But the point I want to make is this was not a victory for American or Western policy. It was the result of the democratic process, or the process within the Soviet Union itself, and one which, objectively speaking, was led by the elected president of Russia. And I think that's something Russians need to forget. All right. I think this attitude of triumphalism and so on led us in the West, in the United States in particular, to try to dictate the terms. And I do think that Russian policy, many of which have not been in Russia's interest, have been largely a reaction to American things. Now, what I would hope will happen now, and it's going to take time, is that we can begin to focus on what the real threats are that face us both and face everyone else, and find a way to cooperate on them. Both the United States and Russia are now deeply divided in many ways internally. Only Americans can solve the problems here, and only Russian citizens can solve the problems there. And I think when we project ourselves into the problems of the other, we tend to make it very difficult to deal cooperatively with those terms which we need to cooperate on. Nuclear weapons, global warming, the other dislocations that are coming about in the world, which require our cooperation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Matlock, for those really thoughtful and thought-provoking remarks. Our next speaker is Dr. Andrey Kortunov. Dr. Kortunov is currently the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, or RIAC. From 1982 to 1995, he held various positions in the Institute for U.S. and Canada Studies, including Deputy Director. He's taught at universities around the world, including the University of California at Berkeley. Since 2011, he's been the Director General of RIAC. He's a member of expert and supervisory committees and boards of trustees of several Russian and international organizations. His academic interests include contemporary international relations and Russian foreign policy. He has and continues to write and publish extensively on these topics. A review of his publications on his RIAC webpage confirms the great expertise he brings to bear on the subject of today's panel. So let's welcome Dr. Kortunov.
Thank you, David, for your kind words. First of all, let me thank Ambassador Matlock for his very rich and very thought-provoking presentation. I think that I can subscribe to every single phrase in his statement, to every single advice that he gives to the US leadership. I might be slightly more critical of the Russian leadership, but generally speaking, I think this is exactly what both states have to do right now. They have to restore the dialogue. They have to demonstrate mutual respect, and they should focus on problems which are common. Gradually, this relationship can be rebuilt, though we cannot expect miracles, and I think it will take time to rebuild it. Since I'm in no position to compete with Ambassador Matlock in his normative approach to the relationship, let me make one or maybe two steps down and talk more specifically about what we can and what we cannot expect from the Biden administration, and how these policies might affect relations between Moscow and Washington, D.C. And of course, the starting positions are not great. I think that despite all these perceptions that President Trump was a friend and an admirer of President Putin, President Trump did contribute a lot to the deterioration of the relationship. He actually almost destroyed the U.S. Russian strategic arms control. He damaged badly the diplomatic dialogue with this diplomatic war, and with Russian and U.S. embassies becoming kind of besieged fortresses in Washington and in Moscow. And also, I think definitely it was quite a blow to the overall fabric of the relationship. So if you take the Biden administration, I think that there is good news and there is bad news for Moscow and for the Kremlin in particular. I will not talk a lot about some of very important areas of the relationship which will be covered by other panelists, namely strategic arms control and US-Russian interactions in the MENA region. Let me just limit myself to saying that even if we have something on top of the New START agreement extension, if we have a reasonable bilateral dialogue on strategic stability, unfortunately, it is not likely to affect the rest of the relationship. And this is also something that can be said about Middle East. I can envisage potential cooperation on issues like Yemen or even on Syria. And of course, Hanna will dwell on that in much more detail, but I don't think this limited collaboration affecting the overall relationship under Biden. So as I said, we have some good news and some bad news. Let me start with good news. I think that the Biden administration is likely to be more professional than their predecessors, including the Biden administration policy towards Russia. Basically, we know more or less all the people who might have impact on the Russian portfolio. We know Secretary Blinken and Deputy Secretary Nuland. Of course, we know the new CIA chief, Bill Burns. We know Jake Sullivan. And these are strong experts. Some of them even are fluent in Russian. Definitely, the US policy is likely to be more predictable and more consistent than it was before. These people know opportunities, but they also know the limitations. There are certain red lines which are not likely to be crossed by the new Biden team. I can also envisage a kind of restoration of the diplomatic dialogue at the level of senior staff, at the level of experts, and maybe even at the level of the US and Russian military. Again, this is a good thing because that would make the Russian-US relationship more stable, and it might allow us to cut risks of an accidental clash or of an inadvertent escalation that otherwise might lead to a disaster of an epic scale. So these are good news. However, there are also some bad news for the Kremlin and for Vladimir Putin personally. And I think that the administration is likely to put much more emphasis on human rights compared to Donald Trump and his team. Essentially, the former president didn't care much about human rights in other countries. Joe Biden does care, and he might increase funding of institutions engaged in the human rights promotion in Russia, and not only in Russia, globally, but since we discuss Russia, he will definitely put more attention to this particular aspect of the US-Russian relations. So incidents like what happened to Navalny will not go unnoticed by the White House, and these incidents will have direct consequences for the relationship. Will it be helpful for the human rights problems inside Russia? I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure, first of all, because Putin is not a leader who yields under pressure. He would like to demonstrate that he doesn't care about the United States position, and he will not tolerate any interference into the Russian domestic affairs. And second, I think that those people and institutions which are supposed to get support from the United States can be labeled as foreign agents and might be discredited in Russia if they receive any kind of assistance from the United States. So I don't see any positive impact of the US human rights emphasis, at least in the nearest future. Of course, a lot will depend on what exactly the United States is going to do here. Second, let me say that the Biden administration is likely to increase political pressure on Russia through neighboring states. I think that the United States is likely to upgrade its support for Ukraine, and probably not only for Ukraine. I think countries like Georgia, maybe Moldova, will also get more attention from Washington than they received under the Trump administration. I don't expect any large-scale US engagement in the Russian neighborhood. I don't envisage a new Marshall Plan for Ukraine because the Biden administration will be limited in what it can do in terms of foreign assistance, and definitely it will go through very serious budgetary problems, which will also set certain limitations on what the United States can do. But definitely the United States will encourage its European partners to render more assistance to Ukraine, and I can foresee more pressure on Berlin, on Paris, on the European Union to be more generous with Ukraine. Also, I can foresee more US-Ukrainian military cooperation, but I don't think that the Biden administration is likely to offer Ukraine a fast track to NATO. I think it's not there. The country is not ripe for a NATO membership, and it's not likely to happen. Let me also say that there are some pockets of cooperation which are likely to sustain all the negative aspects of the relationship. For instance, a reference was made here to the Arctic Council. Russia becomes the Arctic Council chair starting in April of this year for another 2 years. And so far, this cooperation was pretty good. I would even venture to say that the United States had more problems with Canada in the Arctic Council than it had with the Russian Federation. So I can only hope that this particular line of cooperation will be kept separate from other dimensions of this very uneasy and very controversial relationship. I can also imagine, it's in a way, it's a paradox, but I can imagine some limited success in the economic field. In fact, the US-Russian trade is on the rise. It is still very small, but it is growing despite all sanctions and other restrictions. So we can only hope that this trend will continue. I think that we have relatively good opportunities for working together in space, and maybe that will also include cooperation on exotic directions of arms race, like cyber, artificial intelligence, maybe prompt strike, and autonomous lethal weapons. Finally, let me just mention 2 independent variables which might have an impact on the US-Russian relations and on the Biden's approach to Russia in general. First of all, I think a lot will depend on how the Biden administration is going to treat its allies, especially in Europe, because it is definitely interested in putting together a consolidated Western front against Russia, not only against Russia, against China as well, but against Russia in particular. Does it mean that the Biden administration will try to impose the US position on its European allies, or it might rather mean that the Biden administration will listen to Europeans who usually take a more moderate approach to Moscow and who demonstrate an interest, at least in a limited cooperation with the Kremlin? It is still not clear. It is still not clear, for example, will the Biden administration change the Trump approach to the Nord Stream 2 project between Russia and Germany, or will it rather try to push the German leadership harder in order to stop this project? So this is one of independent variables. The second independent variable, which I'd like to mention, is related to US sanctions. We all know that the administration will continue to pursue a policy of sanctions, and if the Biden administration is slow or reluctant to impose new sanctions on Russia, which is not likely to be the case, but if they are too slow, definitely people on the Capitol Hill will take the lead in this. So we will see new sanctions, and definitely we will see old sanctions in place. However, the big question is whether the Biden administration is ready to raise sanctions to an entirely new level, to introduce something really draconian, which will destroy the Russian economy completely, or which might try to destroy the Russian economy completely. For example, whether Biden can do to Russia what Trump did to Iran, just trying to stop the Russian oil and gas from coming to the global markets. Will Biden impose severe restrictions on Russian state banks and other financial institutions? Whether the Biden administration might try to push Russia out of the SWIFT system. And we don't know. But I personally think that Biden will not get that far, not because he doesn't want to hurt the Russian economy, but because sanctions of an EU level might have a significant detrimental impact on the United States and on the stability of the global economic system. Russia is not a major player in the global economy, but it is not insignificant. And for example, if you take the energy market, Russia is one of the energy superpowers together with Saudi Arabia and the United States itself. Therefore, if you take the Russian oil and the Russian gas off the global markets, it will be a major crisis for the global energy system at large. So I don't think that Biden is ready to pay the price for hitting Putin even harder than his predecessor did. My take is that we will see new sanctions, but that will be sanctions mostly imposed on specific individuals and on particular companies, which might be related to the Kremlin or might be linked to the Soviet defense sector. Finally, and that will be my last word here, I think that all these ideas that were expressed by Ambassador Matlock are valid. And I do hope that we will start working along these lines sooner rather than later. But realistically, I can foresee a real change in the U.S. Russian relations taking place after the Biden administration, because in the middle of this decade, maybe 24, maybe 25, we will see a very serious generational change, both in Russia and, and in this country as well. New people will come to the fore, new people will set the agenda, and I do hope that this new generation will demonstrate more wisdom and more foresight than the previous generation did, and more than current leaders of both countries can afford to demonstrate. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. Thank you, Dr. Kortunov, for those really quite striking and insightful remarks. It was very informative to get to hear your thoughts about where things may be heading, at least from the U.S. administration point of view. Our next speaker is Dr. Hanna Notte. Dr. Notte is a senior non-resident scholar with the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. She focuses on arms control and security issues involving Russia, the Middle East, their intersection, and implications for U.S.-European strategy and policy. Among her previous positions, Dr. Notte was a senior political officer for the Sheikh Group, a nonprofit political consultancy focused on the Middle East and North Africa region, an expert on Russian foreign policy in that region, including in the field of arms control and non-proliferation. Dr. Notte spent a year between 2015 and 2016 in Moscow on an Alpha Fellowship with the Institute of Oriental Studies and the Carnegie Moscow Center. She holds a PhD on Russia, U.S. cooperation in the Middle East from the University of Oxford, where she also received an MPhil in international relations in 2014. She's also, like our previous speakers, written extensively in the areas of her expertise. Dr. Notte.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm certainly honored to speak alongside such distinguished and experienced company. And I've been asked specifically to address the prospects for American-Russian cooperation in the Middle East. And I remember a rather poignant observation that a senior Russian expert made to me a few years ago when we were discussing Russia's cooperation back in 2010 with the United States in sanctioning Iran in what then became Resolution 1929. And he said to me at the time, Russian cooperation on Iran was hardly more than pocket change used by Russia to achieve other aims in the reset. Now, we all remember that during that U.S. Russia reset in 2009, 2010, Russia and the United States worked on the New START Treaty, on cooperative missile defense, other issues. But I want to pose to you that we are in a different world today. And I want to start by posing three broad observations to you about the prospect of American-Russian cooperation in the Middle East. First of all, I think an expectation that Russia will shift its position on key issues in the Middle East towards more cooperation with the US, anticipating an improvement in the broader relationship would be misplaced. And Andrey Kortunov has hinted at that. I think until a few years ago, there was still somewhat of a belief in Moscow that if you work with Washington in the Middle East, whether it's the Iran nuclear file, Syria's chemical weapons, that could change the climate of US-Russian relations more broadly. And indeed, I remember when Russia intervened in Syria in September 2015, I was living and working in Moscow at the time. My Russian interlocutors would evoke this notion of принуждать к дружбе. So meaning that Russia, through its actions in Syria, could compel the United States to return to friendship. I believe that the belief in such a possibility is largely absent in Moscow today. The second point I wish to pose to you is that since Russia intervened in Syria in 2015, Russia's interests and relationships in that region have evolved significantly. And this is perhaps part of a broader shift in Russian foreign policy towards an increased diversification of ties, given these enduring tensions with the West. Dmitry Trenin, the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, he put it quite succinctly, I believe. He wrote, after the Ukraine crisis, Russia redefined itself as a self-standing and essentially self-sufficient nation in the middle of Eurasia, neither Western nor Asian. And I would pose that in that context, the Middle East does occupy an increasingly important place, and Russia's interests in that region have become more self-sustaining in their own right. Its economic interests, its political relationships, and they're no longer just conceived through the prism of Russia's relations with the West. And the third reason as to why I think the US should not expect cooperation with Russia to be a low-hanging fruit in the upcoming period is that, quite frankly, Russia feels no real need to adjust its position on core files in the region, Syria or Libya, for instance, based on its current cost-benefit calculation, because Moscow sees its approach to these conflicts as successful, as sustainable. It also understands that the Middle East, perhaps except for the Iran nuclear file, will not be a foreign policy priority for the Biden administration. Now that probably reduces Moscow's incentive to cooperate even further. And let's not forget that the backdrop to potential US-Russian cooperation in the Middle East is also the United States defining Russia as a great power competitor in that region as per its 2018 National Defense Strategy, which is of course not helpful because it obscures the fact that there may indeed be common interests such as counterterrorism and counterproliferation. I do want to say a few words now about different files in the Middle East, and let's start with Syria, where of course active combat operations in that country have largely ceased now. The Syrian government controls about 70% of Syrian territory, except for parts in the northwest of the country that are held by Turkey or armed groups. Northeast Syria, where you have the Kurdish-backed Syrian Democratic Forces supported by the United States. Now, the US does retain between 500 to 800 troops in Syria. We do still have somewhat of a UN-led political process, a constitutional committee that is actually the outcome of the Sochi Congress that the Russians convened in early 2018. That committee has met 5 times. It's not advancing, largely due to stalling by the Syrian government delegation. And in fact, the UN Special Envoy, Geir Pedersen, briefed the Security Council 2 days ago, expressing his disappointment with the lack of advancement. And it's quite remarkable that the US and Russia in the Security Council didn't even manage to agree on a joint declaration, a joint statement in the Council 2 days ago. Now, what does Russia want in Syria today? I think Russian interests are best summed by so-called 3 R's. The first R is rehabilitating the Syrian government, and it sees constitutional reform and the upcoming elections as a vehicle towards that rehabilitation internationally. The second R is refugee return, and then you have reconstruction. So Russia hopes for Western and Arab states to support the reconstruction of Syria, and of course that would entail the lifting of sanctions. The United States has been calling for what it calls a credible political process in Syria, for real change inside Syria, which would entail things like the release of detainees. And to that end, the Trump administration actually put in place an unprecedented sanctions infrastructure against Syria over the last 4 years, kept its forces in the Northeast, notwithstanding the at times erratic statements that Trump made on that issue. Now, the question is, what will we see under Biden going forward? I think the first thing to say is that Syria will very unlikely be a priority to this administration. Policy is still shaping up, key positions are not yet filled, and there has been a debate in Washington as to how future US policy should look like. Some are even arguing for a step-by-step engagement with the Assad government. Some argue, let's leave the anti-ISIS campaign to Russia and Turkey to take care of. What I personally consider likely is that the United States will keep its remaining troops in the country, will retain the sanctions infrastructure. So basically, more of the same approach, largely speaking. While Russia will do its best to keep the existing political process alive, but it will certainly not apply unprecedented pressure on the Assad government. Why? Because Russia perceives its current strategy to be sustainable, and the costs associated with it, whether it's diplomatic costs, economic costs, military costs, perceives those to be manageable. Then there's an important element here which has come up by previous speakers. Russia also does not want to bow to pressure or sanctions. It sees itself under pressure, it sees Syria under pressure, and one doesn't want to bow or yield to that kind of pressure. And Russia is likely playing the long game in Syria, believing that eventually certain Western countries, certain European countries will fold and support reconstruction in Syria. And to reiterate my broader point, which I made earlier, Russia also no longer views Syria as a stepping stone towards broader cooperation with the West. So there are really few incentives from Moscow's point of view to change the current strategy in Syria. Maybe one quick point I want to make, because I know that our next speaker is also addressing arms control and non-proliferation, and that's of interest here. I also just want to say on Syria that it's rather deplorable how the issue of Syrian chemical weapons, which produced really good and constructive cooperation between the two countries back in 2013, 2014, in the removal and destruction of the declared stockpile, how that has become really completely antagonistic and poisonous in the various organs of the OPCW and the UN Security Council. Ambassador Matlock at the beginning noted the importance of civility and mutual respect and diplomacy that characterized the period when he was dealing with his counterparts. And if you just look at the debates on the Syrian chemical weapons issue more recently, it is quite alarming that there's a real lack of civility, I would say. Let's turn to the Iran nuclear file, on which US Russian cooperation has been quite good historically. Now, of course, the Biden administration says it wants to return to the JCPOA, which the Trump administration left back in 2018. What we've seen in recent weeks and even recent days has been this tit for tat between Washington and Tehran as to who should move first. Certainly the devil will be in the detail over the coming weeks and months, because just to quote Secretary of State Blinken, what the US wants is a longer and stronger agreement. So on the nuclear side, that means probably longer sunset provisions and stronger verifications for Iran. But also one wants to bring in other issues, Iran's missile program, its so-called destabilizing activities in the region. And of course, let's not forget, when we talk about the Middle East, the choreography of the US return to the JCPOA is also playing out in a regional context that's much changed compared to 2015, because with the recent Abraham Accords between Israel and certain other states, we have perhaps a greater confluence of interests between those countries, and they're currently lobbying Washington to make sure that Washington won't be too soft on Iran. Now, where does Russia come in here? Russia has, of course, strong ties with Iran. I don't think, sort of observing the region on a daily basis, that Foreign Minister Zarif visits any other foreign capital as frequently as Moscow these days. But Russia has no appetite, in my view, to take up the missiles or proxy issues with Tehran. Now, would Russia help the US get more concessions on the nuclear issue if there were to be follow-up talks? It's a difficult question, because I think on the one hand, Russia argues that the original restrictions on Iran in the original JCPOA were already very robust. And Russia has more generally lamented a tendency by organizations like the IAEA or the OPCW to, how it says, single out certain states, meaning Iran or Syria, for special punitive treatment and treat them like different states. So it will be reluctant to see that kind of pressure against Iran. But on the other hand, Russia also worries about regional escalation involving Iran. And I think it's in the tension between those considerations that Russian diplomacy on the Iran nuclear issue will take shape. I'll just say a few words on Libya at the end. Now, in the interest of time, I won't dwell on developments since the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime in 2011, except to recall that Russia, under President Medvedev at the time, abstained from Resolution 1973 in the Security Council. Now we're pretty much 10 years later, with the lay of the land in Libya rather complex. Russia has been considered a backer of General Haftar in eastern Libya in recent years, though in fact Moscow has worked quite diligently establish ties with a range of Libyan actors. Russia then supported with an increased deployment of private military contractors Haftar's rather ill-conceived offensive on Tripoli, the capital in West Libya, in 2019, which in turn drew an intensified deployment and support by Turkey, support for the UN recognized government, the GNA. This is all just to say that these developments over the last 2 years really led to an entrenchment of foreign interference in Libya and to the so-called Berlin Conference, which we saw here in my city, Berlin, exactly a year ago. Foreign forces still haven't left Libya. The front lines currently run through central Libya. Russian mercenaries are very much present on the ground, even though all foreign forces were supposed to leave the country by a deadline in January. So the picture going forward is very much unclear. Now, what are the prospects here for the US and Russia to do something together? I would say to you that even though the US African Command has been quite vocal over the last year or so with its concern about Russian influence in Libya, the US has actually been fairly disengaged on Libya, and it's quite unclear whether this will change under Biden. Russian diplomats, meanwhile, have criticized the UN-led process. They've cultivated their own ties in Libya. And the Russian narrative on Libya these days is fundamentally, you, the West, broke it, and now you're adopting a flawed approach and trying to fix it. And so Russia is sort of doing its own thing in Libya, dealing with Turkey and circumvention of the West. I think Libya is a file where Russia is playing, again, the long game, looking to establish a basis for power projection into the southern Mediterranean. And I don't see Russia easily giving up those equities and those relationships it's built in Libya, barring, again, a more fundamental change in Russia-West relations. I don't wish to sound all negative, so I'll just say at the end, echoing Andrey again, that perhaps Yemen and also Israel-Palestine could be files where we can see some modest cooperation between the US and Russia. There's some movement on Yemen now. We have a US envoy. The US said it would end its support for the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen. These are kind of positive signs. And even though Russian leverage in Yemen is arguably limited, Russia could play a positive role here vis-a-vis Iran and the Houthis. And then on Israel-Palestine, it would be really positive if the US, for instance, decided to revive the Middle East Quartet, if it's adopting a more even-handed approach on the Israel-Palestine question, because Russia associates a legacy of positive cooperation with that quartet. So I think the United States engaging Russia within multilateral diplomacy on these files would be welcome. On issues like Syria and Libya, I don't see much room for rapprochement. And the bottom line, again, to me, is that Moscow will cooperate in the Middle East where it perceives it's clearly to be in its interest, but it will not do favors to the US under the illusion of being able to fundamentally change the trajectory of the relationship, and it needs much more for that than joint work on Middle East issues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those remarks and the incredibly concise way you were able to pack in so many important observations about a very complex set of situations. At this point, let's take a brief pause. And Helen, I think, would like to make an announcement about CLE credit. And perhaps she can also, at this point, say something about how audience members can ask questions so that they can begin formulating those now. Yeah.
And then for people who want to ask questions, if you could write your questions in the Q&A box, we'll get to those after the discussion. And now I'll hand it back.
Great. All right. Our last panelist is Collina. He's the director of policy at the Ploughshares Fund, where he brings to bear his enormous experience in nuclear weapons, missile defense, and non-proliferation issues. He's worked extensively as a researcher, analyst, and advocate to strengthen the efforts to end U.S. nuclear testing, rationalize anti-missile programs, extend the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and secure a Senate ratification of the New START Treaty. among many other activities. Prior to joining Ploughshares Fund in 2014, he served as research director of the Arms Control Association. He was the executive director and co-founder of the Institute for Science and International Security and the director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, among other leadership positions. He's also published widely in major magazines and journals and has appeared frequently in national media, including in the New York Times, CNN, NPR, and so on. He's testified frequently before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and regularly engages in briefing congressional staff on these issues. So let's welcome Tom.
Got it. Thank you, David. And thank you, Helen, and thanks to N.Y.U and the Journal of International Law and Politics for having me here today. Very glad to be here. Building off what Ambassador Matlock and others have said about the sad state of U.S. Russian relations, I won't go into that, except to say that no matter how bad relations are between the two countries, they will always have an interest in preventing nuclear war between them. And so this is an existential threat to both countries that will exist as long as nuclear weapons exist. And so again, no matter how bad the relation, there'll always be a reason to talk. And I think that's where we have to hope they will go. I want to talk about three areas where those talks could be successful in terms of reducing nuclear risks. Those three areas are arsenal reductions, nuclear doctrine, and nuclear modernization. So starting with arsenal reductions, the good news is that, as we all know, the two sides recently extended the New START treaty. We can all be really thankful for that. It took the Biden administration less than 2 weeks to get that done, a really good positive start to rebuilding the relationship. This is something that the Trump administration could not do in 4 years of on again, off again effort, and they really only tried in the very last bit, the last year of the Trump administration. The Trump administration believed they had leverage to make demands on Russia and China to get engaged. They did not. And so Trump left office as the first American president in 50 years to have not produced a single agreement in this area, and as has previously been mentioned, actually took us backwards by withdrawing from the INF treaty. So both the Biden administration and Russia have announced that they will continue that process to try to negotiate further arms control, building on the New START treaty. So what are the next steps? What could we see as a possible combination of negotiations for the next step after New START? Well, the first thing to say is that there's bipartisan U.S. support for limiting all nuclear weapons. And by this, I mean not just strategic or long-range nuclear weapons, but tactical nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons often on a very high yield that are deployed on shorter range delivery systems. These have not been captured by arms control up to now. And the United States would like to limit Russia's larger than the US stockpile of tactical weapons. On their side, Russia wants to limit US missile defenses. So the question here is there a deal in the offing? I would hope that if we look at strategic reductions, including tactical weapons, we could get down to 500 or less total weapons. This is from the New START limits of 1,550 strategic weapons. To me, I think we really need to think about how many nuclear weapons does it take to destroy civilization. And if that number is just a few hundred, which I would argue it is, then staying at levels of 1,000 or more, are almost missing the point. Yes, reductions are good, but at some point we need to get reductions down below which, if nuclear war takes place, we don't destroy humanity in the process. And so to me, we need to be arguing, aiming for much lower limits than we have been, and that people seem to be thinking of right now. So I think we need to be thinking of much lower arsenal levels, 500 or less, eliminating tactical nuclear weapons, which I think have no justification in arsenals, and prohibiting things like new weapons like hypersonics, which I think have been hyped, certainly in the US side. The effect of hypersonics has been hyped, and this would be a great opportunity to seek a ban in both countries on hypersonic weapons. Now, as I said, the US wants to control tactical nuclear weapons. Russia, which has an advantage in that area, is probably not going to want to do that. What Russia wants is limitations on missile defense, which the United States is very reluctant to do. But there's a possibility, I won't say I'm hopeful, there's a possibility that the US could offer limitations on missile defense for limitations or elimination of Russian tactical nuclear weapons. And the way I think this could work is that the United States has about 40 long-range missile defense interceptors deployed in Alaska and California. The United States also is developing longer-range interceptors that are deployed aboard Aegis cruisers that are mobile. The United States could offer to limit those deployments to, say, 100 strategic capable interceptors. This would be a limit applied to both sides. This would allow the United States to claim that it has a defense against rogue states, for example, North Korea, although I would question the effectiveness of those interceptors against even the North Korean threat. But at a limit of around 100, it would hopefully reassure Russia and China that those defenses are not aimed at Russia and China's strategic offensive weapons, which is, of course, the concern of Russia and China at this point. So if the Biden administration is open to limiting defenses, it may have a way to gain some leverage on Russian tactical nuclear weapons. Now, if the Biden administration goes that way, that will be very unpopular, particularly with Republicans in Congress, who see missile defense as essentially an article of faith. And therefore, the Biden administration may have to forego a treaty. It would be next to impossible to pass a treaty through the Senate that would limit missile defenses, and therefore may have to settle for an executive agreement. I think that would be a wise move, as we saw by the Trump administration withdrawing from the INF treaty. Having a treaty ratified by the Senate does not prevent it from being dismantled later by the next administration. So I would urge for going for a more meaningful agreement that limits missile defenses, even if that means that a treaty is not the form that it takes. Second area is nuclear doctrine. You know, since the Cold War, the US and Russia, in my view, have been focused on the wrong threat. That's the threat of intentional nuclear attack or a surprise nuclear attack by Russia or the United States against the other. You know, no sane president would launch such an attack because they know it would be suicide. Neither the United States nor Russia can launch such an attack that would prevent a retaliation from the other. So intentional attack, surprise attack are both suicidal actions that no sane president would pursue. But blundering into war by mistake is a much more realistic possibility. We could blunder into war based on false alarms, based on cyber attacks that make us think that we're under attack. And so that, to me, should be the focus of US and Russian policy of how to prevent us from blundering into war by mistake. So how do we prevent that? Well, primarily, we need to give presidents more decision time. Because right now, if there were a warning of an attack, a president might have just a few moments, a few minutes to make a decision. And in both the United States and Russia, these are sole authority decisions. The presidents make these decisions all by themselves. They may not seek the advice they need. They may be acting on bad information or at a bad moment. Certainly in the case of President Trump, who may be unhinged, presidents making these decisions by themselves in short periods of time is a recipe for disaster. So two things we need to do. We need to get rid of sole authority. And as we saw in our own situation with President Trump, Having an unhinged president with their finger on the button is just tremendously dangerous, and there's no justification for it. That authority should be shared with Congress, with other democratically elected decision makers. And we should encourage Moscow to do that too. We don't need to make these decisions quickly, and we don't need sole authority to make that decision. The other thing we need to change is both countries maintain first use policies. This is very dangerous, particularly in combination with sole authority, because the president can order the first use of nuclear weapons on their sole authority. Again, I don't think any sane president would initiate nuclear war. There's no strategic rationale to initiate nuclear war. And I think both nations would feel safer from the possibility of a surprise attack, as low as I think that is, if both announced they would not use nuclear weapons first. Third is modernization. Both nations are spending trillions of dollars to rebuild their nuclear arsenals. You know, look, this is money that could be much better spent in other places. Just looking at the U.S. case, the Biden administration coming in, needing to deal with the coronavirus, needing to deal with climate change, racial inequality, a collapsing economy. That money could be much better spent dealing with much higher priority issues. And so at a minimum, we should delay modernization until we see whether another round of arms control, another round of arms reductions is in the offing, because it's much cheaper to modernize a smaller arsenal than it is to modernize a larger arsenal. And specifically, I would call out the United States and the Biden administration to rethink the plan to rebuild a new generation of land-based ballistic missiles, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. The United States is planning to spend up to $260 billion on this over the lifetime of the program. And so we don't need these weapons for deterrence. They increase the risk of blundering into nuclear war by mistake, because these are the weapons that a president would feel pressure to launch first on warning of attack, which could be a false alarm. And so we would be much safer and save big money by canceling this new ICBM and then considering phasing out ICBMs over time. So the United States and Russia can reduce nuclear dangers and save hundreds of billions of dollars by working together, by restarting a strategic dialogue to reduce nuclear dangers. They must get together and start talking soon, and I hope they do so. And I will end it there. Thanks very much.
Great. I want to thank all of the panelists for a really terrific session, incredibly informative and efficiently presented. I think we can begin the question and answer period at this stage. I'll restrain myself from asking the first question because we already have a queue of questions. Everybody who has a question, please formulate them now, and I will then read them to the panelists who can then respond. So our first question, and I can't actually tell who it's from because the name isn't specified. But let me read the first question is, what did America do right or wrong with regard to the war in Crimea and the eventual annexation by Russia? And if it's a territorial scenario like this emerges again, how should America react? Who would like to answer this question? Perhaps it falls within Ambassador Matlock's area of experience most directly.
I would say that could have been prevented if President Obama had had the courtesy to attend the Olympics in Sochi and to spend an hour with President Putin and to assure him that whatever might be the appearances, we would never accept Ukraine into NATO. That was the thing that made it possible. Now, having been, it has happened now, and the question on my part is, what do the great majority of the people in Crimea prefer? Because that was a question that was never even addressed at the time Crimea was considered part of Ukraine. And under the Soviet Union, only part of Crimea was under, you might say, Kiev. Kiev, of course, was under Moscow's control, and Sevastopol and the naval base remained under Moscow control. So the idea that even in the Soviet Union, that in any way Crimea was effectively part of Ukraine is an illusion. Finally, I would also say that we set a legal precedent, the United States did, when it recognized Kosovo as independent against the objection of Serbia. After all, the Helsinki Final Act said that borders should not be changed without mutual agreement. So, I would say also, we need to remember that what happened in Crimea happened without a single casualty. So when we put this in context, it seems to me that clearly you had a reaction to the possibility that Ukraine, having entered NATO, would deprive Russia of the naval base at Sevastopol. Now, that doesn't make that what happened right, or it doesn't make it even in Russia's interest, because certainly it's not in Russia's interest to have its closest and arguably most essential neighbor with a territorial dispute that may go on for generations. But I do think that we need to not look at this as simply a case of Russian aggression. They can make a very good case that the separation of Kosovo from Serbia was a case of NATO and U.S. aggression. But so rather than looking at those things, I think we do have to look at a solution. And if it were possible, for example, for both sides to agree that there be a internationally supervised referendum, because, you know, it's not in Ukraine's interest to have an area which is basically not totally loyal to it. So when we get to the basic interests of these countries, they really need to settle it. But I know that all of these things are extremely difficult because they raise some of the most elemental emotional questions. But simply to look at the annexation of Crimea as simply a case of Russian aggression or something that was carried out without the will of the majority of the people in Crimea, I think is incorrect to look at it. And I think we have to begin to recognize that such things as spheres of influence are not a matter of international law that can be granted or not. It's rather like gravity. And you may not like it, but there are natural spheres of influence regarding vital security issues. I believe that no Russian government will ever allow Ukraine or Georgia to be a member of NATO. And I think the idea that somehow that would solve their internal problems is a total illusion. So in a way, we need to, and I would say also, I think it would be much easier for Ukraine and Russia to solve that problem if the United States would stay out of it. If anybody should get involved, it's Europe. But even so, there too, we get, I think, great problems. I think this is an excellent question, but we have to recognize that changing things is going to be very difficult. And as a matter of fact, I don't see that Ukraine is going to be able to live a normal life and ever develop prosperity if it doesn't do so having normal relations with Russia. So the Ukrainians, I think, really do have to rethink some things, and particularly the rejection of a federal system, which they consistently do, despite things, well, you know, and I think things are getting even worse. But in the final analysis, both Russia and Ukraine are suffering, I think, from the current situation. And I would hope that they would find a way to deal with in a way that is ultimately acceptable to both sides. But if that happens, I think it's going to happen primarily between the Ukrainian leadership and the Russian leadership.
Thank you. That's would any of our other panelists like to respond to the question or to Ambassador Matlock's answer?
I'm sorry?
No. I just wanted to ask whether any of the other panelists would like to make any comments, and it seems that the answer is no. So we'll move on to another question. Okay, this is a question from Jonathan Wood. It's a somewhat long question, so let me read it. Given the mention of the Arctic by Dr. Kortunov, where I live, work, and study, Iceland, Arctic shipping has become a major issue both economically and legally. With the recent release of the Russian Arctic strategy until 2035 and the upcoming Russian Federation's chairmanship of the Arctic Council, do you foresee any increased tensions between the U.S. and Russia, with the latter's perhaps legally dubious claims of sovereignty over the Northern Sea Route, its increased viability, and the subsequent militarization that use entails? Or should we expect a return to normalcy with the Biden administration, given it's unlikely to engage in disastrous Arctic policies, such as the proposed purchase of Greenland under Trump's administration?
Let me make a comparison. There is the so-called Northwest Passage in the north of the South American continent. It belongs to Canada, generally speaking, but the United States and Canada disagree on the status of this route. Canada believes that it owns this passage. The United States maintains that it's an international sea route. So there is a problem. However, this problem does not lead to a very, intense U.S.-Canadian dispute. The United States, as you know, has signed but has not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. That makes the Canadian position slightly stronger than the US position, but nevertheless, this dispute is likely to continue. I think that we might face the same situation with the Arctic route to the north of the Russian shores. Right now, this dispute is more or less academic because this route, if you take high altitude route from Asia to Europe, is packed with ice, and it is not suitable for navigation unless you have really very powerful icebreakers. However, with the global melting, definitely high altitude routes can become open for transit. And then I think we might see a disagreement between Russia and the United States about how far the Russian territorial waters and the Russian special economic zone extends. I don't think that this route will become an important trade communication link anytime soon. So I don't consider it to be a major bone of contention between the two countries if there is no intention to turn it into a big geopolitical issue. Now, in terms of the arms race in the Arctic region, it's a very different question. The Arctic Council does not deal with security matters except for using the border guards in rescue operations. So the issue of the arms race in the Arctic region is an issue between NATO and Russia. Unfortunately, there are very few contacts between NATO and Russia right now, and NATO demonstrates more presence in the Arctic region, which might become an issue of serious disagreements between Moscow and Brussels, between Moscow and Washington. That might lead to a new arms race, and that might definitely become a negative factor, which again might indirectly affect the performance of the Arctic Council. But let me end with saying that the real problem of the Arctic Council is not between Russia and the United States, or between Russia and any other member of the Arctic Council. The real problem is the relationship between littoral states and non-littoral states. Because on the one hand, all members of the Arctic Council would like to engage non-littoral states into some activities in the Arctic region. They want them to invest, but at the same time, they do not want to turn the Arctic Ocean into what they call the common heritage of the mankind. They don't want to open the Arctic region for all, because they're concerned that that will be detrimental to the preservation of the biodiversity, to managing resources and other things. So it's an issue with countries like China, India, Japan, and some members of the European Union. Now, as far as Russia is concerned, it has already defined its priorities for its chairmanship in the Arctic Council. And that will be environment. It will be about indigenous peoples of the Arctic region and about Arctic regionalism at large. So far, I don't see any immediate dangers for the institution. Let me repeat that both sides were very, I think, wise in their approach. They were able to keep the council separate from the geopolitical competition, and some even argued that we should look at the Arctic Council as a model for other regions and other problems. I'm not sure that the Arctic Council model can be replicated or upgraded, but I think that there is common interest in the United States and in Russia to keep it operating as it does right now. And definitely it's a very clear symbol of remaining multilateralism, which unfortunately is in crisis today.
Thank you very much. Do any of the other panelists want to add any remarks? Okay. We have a number of questions on the queue and limited time, so we should take that into account in our answer, how we answer the questions if possible. So here's a question that I'm not sure I understand entirely, from Leonard Horowitz. In view of the thesis of the book Red Notice, do you believe entities in Russia are investable, which I believe may be inevitable, but I'm not certain. I don't know whether anyone is prepared to answer the question. Okay, so Leonard, if you want to clarify the question in some way, then we can come back to it again. For now, I'll ask a question from Science Cathedral. And this is, I think, directed at Ambassador Matlock. To what extent international law aims to act like gravity and be used as a tool for influence? Can international law acquire such gravity, or will it be forever limited due to the structure of the UN Security Council? Now, that might take us somewhat away from the main lines of our inquiries here, but Professor Matlock, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think that we make a big mistake if we confuse the concept of international law with domestic law. And, you know, we often say this is a violation of international law, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, international law has traditionally a number of assumptions. One is that agreements are observed, pactus sunt servanda, but another is that rebus sextantibus, circumstances remaining the same. Now, many of the things that we argue about today as indubitably against international law, in fact, one can argue that in many cases, the international law would have modified the original agreement because strategic circumstances changed. Rebus did not, it was not sextantibus, things didn't remain the same, but changed radically. That would be particularly true if you're interpreting, for example, Russia's action in annexing Ukraine. Now, also, I would say, I think we have to be a little careful in accusing other countries of aggression against international law. If anything was a case of aggression, violation of the most basic principles of international law, it was the United States invasion of Iraq. Now, for us then to accuse others who maybe also violated in a literal sense something, they are aggressive and we are not, well, I think that is an illusory, if one wants to say, approach. It simply isn't going to work. After all, yes, one can say that there were a number of agreements that were violated, but nevertheless, if the strategic circumstances changed, then under traditional international law, one can have the ability to pull out. Also, I think that we have to understand that if countries that really want to champion international law, they have to be willing to live by it themselves. And in many of the issues we have, the United States itself has not. If we get into the Middle East, we cannot even, without great political difficulty, even talk about the multiple violations that Israel makes of international law in its settlement policy, and the refusal of Palestinian rights, and the unwillingness even to be judged by international courts. I mean, we are living in a world where the international law remains, I might say, a goal. It should be for everybody. But let's face it, none of us are completely innocent when it comes to violating that. And as long as we don't recognize fundamental geopolitical realities, the abstract principles of international law are not going to supersede what I would consider international reality, one of which is that every state, large and small, is going to be extremely sensitive about having military alliances of which they are not part, bordering with them. Certainly the United States has shown regarding Cuba, the Caribbean, even all of South America, we wouldn't tolerate it. And yet we expect Russia to ignore intrusions from the outside, even on areas which traditionally were part of their country and which Russia at one time voluntarily relinquished. I mean, let's grow up. Why can't we recognize that, first of all, if you want laws that everybody will observe, you have to have laws that everybody agrees to. And second, if you have an agreement under certain overall circumstances, and then one side changes the strategic picture, then under traditional international law, the other side is not bound. And I think one of the problems has been that we in the United States in particular, but in Europe as well, Western Europe as well, we have looked at international law as something abstract, something we apply when we want to, when it's inconvenient, we ignore. And I really think that this doesn't mean that we all shouldn't be abiding by international law, but if we ever do, the most powerful countries have to be willing to do so, even when it is not, they don't consider it in their interest. Well, end of rant.
Okay, we now have, I think we may have 6 questions, and we're at 11:45, which is in theory the end of the session. I think Helen indicated at one point that perhaps we could go a little bit longer. Is that right, Helen?
Yeah. We can. Our next panel starts at 12, so if we could stop like 11:55.
Okay, so we have a few more minutes, but please take that into account. Let me just add one observation about one of the remarks that Professor Matlock made, which is, I think that I can't help but mention that the contrast between international law and domestic law is sometimes overdrawn. And I think we've been experiencing the way in which that contrast may be overdrawn quite a bit recently when we think about our constitutional law, and particularly in certain areas, including, for example, the separation of powers. And we've seen how difficult it is to have our domestic constitutional law enforced in ways that are perhaps reminiscent in some respects of international law. Okay, with that editorial comment, let me ask the next question. This is from Nathan Saad. Could we possibly address the China factor in the U.S. Russia relationship? Possibly a bit too broad, but would anyone be able to comment on how the new U.S. administration sees the Russia-China relationship, how the U.S. Russia relationship affects it, and the possible dangers of driving the two closer together through tougher sanctions and so on? So yes, who would like to address this? And again, bear in mind that we have only a very short amount of time left. Please, Dr. Kortunov, yes.
Let me draw your attention to a very interesting document that has just been published by the Center for New American Security in Washington. One of the co-authors of the report is Andrey Kendall-Taylor, who was considered for a high position in the National Security Council. And the report is titled Navigating the Deepening Russia-China Partnership. Very indicative, and I think that these are the ideas which are likely to resonate with the Biden administration. Essentially, I think that there was an evolution of the American thinking on this issue for a long time, at least among US experts. There was a kind of fashion to argue that this relationship is purely situational, tactical, that the interests of the two countries diverge, and sooner or later, maybe rather sooner than later, there'll be a major crisis between Beijing and Moscow. So right now, I think the perception has changed, and it implies that this is for real, and this is not just a situational alliance, not just something directed against the United States, but it is a strategic partnership which will be there for a long time. So the United States has to choose between what I would call dual containment, to contain both Russia and China at the same time, which will be expensive and maybe even dangerous, and selecting one one side of this partnership to work with and to break this alliance. So in the report which I referred to, there were a couple of ideas on how the United States can disrupt the Russian-Chinese partnership. I think most of recommendations are a little bit far-fetched. I don't think they will work the way they are presented. But definitely the United States will have to deal with Russia and China simultaneously. And though the challenges presented by the two countries are very different, and it's very difficult to generalize, but I think that right now the United States is consolidating this partnership by taking a very assertive, not to use a different word, position towards both Beijing and Moscow. I don't think that that will change under the Biden administration. And I think that Russia and China will stick to each other, confronting what they believe to be hegemonic aspirations of the United States.
Okay. Unless somebody else would like to speak, let me go on to the next question. Okay. This is from Benjamin Gardner. Doesn't the suggestion that the Trump administration pull out for arms control treaties was against Putin's preference naively presume that Putin could not have welcomed same as pretext for a desired buildup of new generation of weaponry, a short-term vacation from treaty commitments into which he may welcome longer-term reentry? And doesn't the citation to deemed aggressive Trump State Department policy wrongly ascribe same to Trump rather than Pompeo, or before him, the shorter-lived Tillerson, who Trump fired 10 days after he had a phone call with Putin, given that by all reports, Trump was highly unlikely to have been attentive on his own to the details or even the broad strokes, at least relative to his concern whether the Secretary of State was a domestic political loyalist. Does anybody want to briefly respond? Yes, please, Tom.
Well, there's a lot in there. You know, I'll just say that whether you ascribe it to Trump or others of his advisors, like John Bolton, his one-time national security advisor, clearly the Trump administration was opposed to arms control and frankly to almost any international engagement that Trump didn't himself initiate. So Trump was opposed to treaties negotiated by others, including Reagan, right, the INF treaty, to the New START treaty negotiated by Obama, to the Iran deal negotiated by Obama as well, and essentially did not initiate anything of his own. Even the effort at the very end of the Trump administration to extend the New START treaty, in my opinion, was not serious. And you can see that in the way that they tried to hide their lack of ability to extend New START by saying their effort here was to get China into the New START extension. And China's opposition to that, the Trump administration blamed China for preventing the extension of New START. So the Trump administration and the people within were the entire time opposed to arms control, opposed to diplomatic approaches to reducing nuclear dangers. And as a result, became the only administration in the last 5 decades to make no progress in that direction and essentially take us backwards. Which is why it was up to the Biden administration within 2 weeks of coming into office to extend New START, which they thankfully did.
Thank you. And let me ask, we'll go back to Leonard Horowitz's question.
I think that Hannah had something she wanted to say, yeah.
I'm sorry, Hannah, I didn't see that.
That's fine. I just very quickly wanted to add to what Tom said to this question, which asked about new generation weaponry, that some of the systems that Russia is developing these days, whether it's in the hypersonic sphere, the so-called avant-garde, or the nuclear power cruise missile, the Burevestnik, some of these very novel systems, the development of these started much earlier than even the New START treaty itself. I mean, it is really a response to a perceived threat of a U.S. missile defense buildup that really started in the early 2000s after the US withdrew from the ABM treaty. And you can even find the origins of some of those R&D programs earlier in the context of the Strategic Defense Initiative under Reagan. So I would just caution to say that what we're seeing today on the Russian military innovation side is purely a response to this recent crisis in U.S. Russia arms control. And it's really only until what Tom talked earlier about, we get to a place where we can address tactical nuclear weapons, US missile defense, we put these broader issues on the table, that I think we can see a fundamental change there.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments? Nope. All right. Bill Browder, who wrote Red Notice, faced personal death and essentially had his investments in Russia facing confiscation from Putin, including through punitive and phony tax measures and the torture and death of his Russian tax attorney. So this could happen to anyone. Therefore, can an American invest in Russia? Does anybody want to address this question?
Well, if no one else wants to respond to this question, let me say that Americans do invest in Russia. And if you go to the American Chamber of Commerce or to the U.S. Russian Business Council, you'll find many members who are pretty successful in Moscow. I don't want to say that there are no problems, and definitely there is a political cloud which definitely raises investment risks. There is also an issue of sanctions. So many US companies are engaged in what I would call overcompliance. They don't want to be exposed to additional sanctions. So the overall climate, political climate between Russia and the United States is not very conducive. But the United States investment in the Russian Federation has demonstrated a degree of resilience. And if you look at the trade statistics, you'll see that basically trade is growing. Again, I think that it's not likely to be a major factor for any of the countries. Political considerations will continue to overshadow economic benefits. But I would not say that Americans cannot invest. They do.
Very good. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time now. And so my apologies to those who are on the queue with questions that we didn't have time to address. Let me just very briefly, once again, thank our panelists for this really quite fantastic session and for your willingness to participate in such a helpful and meaningful way. This has been a great start to the symposium. So I'll thank everybody, and I think it'll be the end of our session, but perhaps Helen should say something at this point.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank all of our panelists for a really sort of fascinating and informative discussion. And I hope that everyone joins us for our next panel, which starts in 5 minutes on disputed territories and revolutions in post-Soviet space. And we'll be using a separate link. So you should have received all of the links in a separate email. And also we'll be having 2 panels tomorrow. So thanks everyone again, and hope to see you at the next panel.
Bye-bye.